U.S. foreign policy towards the old Middle East was simple. It goes like this. He's an SOB, but he's our SOB. But then the Arab Spring came along, and those, well, let's just call them dictators, were no longer in power. The new Middle East has a new set of rules, and no one really knows what those are. And it's not just us. The people and the leaders in the region don't seem to know what they're doing either. But that doesn't mean we can't try to figure it out. Paul Danahar is the former BBC Middle East bureau chief. He's been at every major event in that region since the start of the Iraq War. He's currently BBC North America bureau chief and has written a book called The New Middle East. Paul Danahar joins me in the studio. Paul, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Make the case for us that an American needs to be concerned about all this chaos and upheaval in the Middle East.
Well, the thing about the Middle East is it doesn't play by Vegas rules. What happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. And we've seen that in the way that going back to the oil shock really in 1973, where America kind of thought that it could kind of get away with doing whatever it wanted and letting Israel do whatever it wanted. And when the Arab world finally realized they had power with oil, it changed the whole game. And ever since then, you've either had Islamic fundamentalism coming out of the region, you've had instability in the region, you've had America's biggest ally in the region, Israel, under threat. And at the end of the day, America can't step back completely from the Middle East because it has too many interests there. And it just has to face that fact. The question is, how much influence can it have? How much influence does it want to have? And then how does it exert that influence? I think the big problem for America is that if it doesn't project power, if it doesn't project a sense that it cares, then it has to do something to enforce its interests. If it just sits back and watches events, then people think they're not paying attention and they can get away with things.
So do you think the influence is waning, though?
I think the problem with America, particularly over Syria, was that it could have made a big difference at the beginning, and it didn't. It sat back and waited to see what would happen. And now it's got a really big mess in the Middle East. And if you look at the situation with regard to its biggest ally there, Israel, for the first time, Israel's now got Al-Qaeda on its doorstep. And the conflicts it was fighting in the past were about land. They were with Hezbollah or they were with Hamas, and they're both considered to be terrorist groups by America. But they were fighting over land. So there was scope for negotiation. You can say, I want this bit and you want that bit. When you're fighting over God, that's a lot harder to come to an agreement over because people are just not prepared to compromise.
God has definitely made a resurgence in the Middle East. He's always been there.
He's always been there, but he's back with a vengeance in many ways. I think the thing is that what's happened is that the dictators kept a lid on a lot of the tensions in the Middle East, and they also created a lot of them. This is Islamism, but it's also it's not just Islam, it's religion, because in Israel, you've got a big religious divide there between the seculars and the ultra-Orthodox and the religious Zionists. So religion is playing a bigger part across the region. The question is, how do you shape it in a way that allows you to get your interests out of it, but doesn't drag you into wars? Because it's very understandable that after Afghanistan and Iraq, America simply doesn't want to get involved in somebody else's war anymore. But at the same time, it does have interests there. Barack Obama talked about, how do I decide whether I go into the Congo or whether I go into Syria? The reality is the war in the Congo, which has been going on for many, many years and killed thousands of people, and I've been to the Congo and I've seen what a mess it is, it doesn't make much difference to the outside world. You can have...
It's not strategic.
It's not strategic, and it basically means the people that are suffering are the people in the Congo. It doesn't make much of a big difference, even to the rest of Africa. But when you have Syria falling apart, it does make a big difference. It makes a big difference for stability and therefore oil. It makes a big difference for Israel. It makes a big difference if you've suddenly got basically a safe haven for Islamic fundamentalists. So you can't get away from it.
Let's go back to Israel for a minute, because Israel's always said, we're the only democracy in the Middle East. Now there's talk of democracy in these other Arab Spring countries. Why is Israel so bothered by everything that's been happening?
Israel understandably is paranoid about its neighbors, because its neighbors, in history, in modern history, have basically said, we want to get rid of you. So it's quite understandable that they are nervous. The issue with Israel is that it doesn't trust anyone around it. it's always managed to get by basically dealing with dictators and their generals and coming to an agreement. And so you had all these kind of deals pulled together in kind of smoky rooms behind the scenes. And Israel was quite happy with dictatorships next door because, they were simple. You knew who you were dealing with. There was one guy at the top. He had a regime. He stayed there for 30, 40 years, and you didn't have to get any nasty surprises. Now it's all changed. Now they don't know who's going to be running a country tomorrow. So that makes them nervous. Israelis get nervous about change. They get nervous about things they don't think they can control.
And the Arab street is very anti-Israel.
It is, but I think at the moment it's got bigger problems. It's got problems at home. That's why I think the Arab-Israeli conflict that we talk about has actually become a Palestinian-Israeli conflict, because the Arabs are just too busy to worry about what's going on with the Palestinians. And there's always been a bit of a hypocrisy anyway with the way the Arab leaders have dealt with the Palestinian cause. I mean, if they really cared...
Yeah, they talk about it.
They
don't
would
do
have used
anything.
oil to do something about it, like they did in 1973. But they haven't. They've used the Palestinians as a stick to beat Israel with. They go to conferences and they moan and they groan and they promise money which they don't deliver. But realistically, it's been a Palestinian-Israel issue, but the Arabs have claimed it as a way to kind of get a bit of PR.
So, Paul, does anybody care about the peace process anymore?
Well, the Palestinian people do, but they just don't believe anything's going to happen. And the problem is now that
I don't think the Americans care anymore. I don't think the Europeans care. I don't think the other Arabs care.
No, I think that most people don't care because most people think it isn't going to happen. The issue is you've got two Palestinian groups. So even if you do get this fantastic breakthrough deal with John Kerry's trying to organize, he's only really organizing it with the people on the West Bank. He's not finishing the Palestinian issue because the people in Gaza, Hamas, are not talking to anybody because nobody will talk to them. So, you're not resolving the issue. You may be getting to a point where, you get some kind of deal with the West Bank. But increasingly, the West Bank's becoming, a non-viable proposition as a state because so much of it is eaten up by the presence of settlers. Not that they take up a lot of the land. They don't. They take up about 5% of the West Bank.
But the idea.
Issue, well, no, it's more than that. The issue is that Israel controls 70% of the West Bank so that it can keep the settlers living on 5% of the land safe. So Israel controls the land. It controls the roads. It controls where Palestinians can live and where they can build their homes because they want to make sure that the settlers are safe. So the UN draws up these figures and said, this is how much land Palestinians get access to. This is how much land is controlled by Israel. So these figures are all put out by the UN. But the problem is that it's expensive for Israel to keep running a settler community. Increasingly, they are less and less ideologically like the majority of the Israelis who live in the kind of Tel Aviv area. That's why people say, we have to do it quickly. We have to do it now. We have to make some kind of progress. Because I think the Israelis that believe that there is a possibility of a deal, and the Palestinians and the Americans and the Europeans know that the longer it goes on, the harder it is politically for Israel to basically do a deal.
Paul Danahar is in the studio with me. He's an award-winning journalist. He's the BBC North America bureau chief. His book is called The New Middle East, The World After the Arab Spring. Let's go to Egypt because the Muslim Brotherhood and the army are in this death spiral, essentially. They're the two biggest political groups that have power in Egypt, really. What's going to happen with that?
Well, Egypt's a bit of it's really quite sad what happened in Egypt because, in 2011, when there was a revolt, suddenly there was an opportunity to have a third party, i.e. the people that led the revolution, the kind of what people call secular vanguard, the youth.
But they weren't organized.
They weren't organized, and that was the problem. And most of them just became, they either just went out and demonstrated every 5 minutes and complained and moaned, but they didn't build anything. So when the Brotherhood failed, and failed quite catastrophically, there was no alternative but going back to the army. And I think that's been really damaging for Egypt because Egypt is a really important country in the Middle East.
Was there a better option?
Well, there was no option because the people that kind of led the revolution didn't build one. They didn't even try. And that means that you go from the possibility of something and people, if the first year of the revolution, people were fighting with the army again because the army made such a mess of everything. You had people being beaten up and shot on the streets. You had women being subjected to virginity tests. It was appalling. But they didn't, the seculars, they didn't spend any time building anything or creating political parties. Now
and they're still not doing it.
They're still not doing it. They're still going out into the streets and demonstrating. Now, you can argue that it takes a while to do that, but there would have been a better way forward if they'd have basically said, right, look, let's get a new parliament. With a new parliament, we can impeach Morsi, because Morsi was useless. I mean, there's no two ways about it. Even the Brotherhood didn't really want him. He wasn't their first or second choice. They got him by accident. So, there was an argument that you probably could have made to the Brotherhood that, look, this guy's no good. Get rid of him. You may have to sort of step back out of power for a bit, but you have a chance of getting power again in the future. But they didn't do that. They got the army in to do a quick job, and now I think that's put back democracy in Egypt quite a way.
Because neither one of those two groups really cares about democracy or protecting the rights of minorities.
No, they don't, not at all. And so, if you're a Christian, in many ways, you're just as scared of the army as you are of the Muslim Brotherhood. And Christians and Shia are always used as kind of a scapegoat whenever anybody's unhappy anywhere in the Arab world. So, I mean, Christians are nervous. I mean, they're nervous because they saw what happened to their community in Iraq when that fell apart. I think Christians across the region are increasingly nervous about their role, what kind of future they're going to have, and nowhere more so than in Egypt.
And the numbers are really going down.
Yeah, but it's just too uncertain for everybody, and they know that if somebody wants to kind of cause some problems and show that the country's falling apart, they go after the Christians. They're an easy target because they're quite a big target. I think the Christian community made some mistakes in the recent coup because they quite publicly sided with the idea of having a coup. And that made them a very easy target for the kind of more hardline Islamists.
But in their defense, I mean, millions of people went out into the street.
Oh yeah, they did, unquestionably. But the point was, you could have had a process where you had millions of people on the streets, and some kind of deal had to be done where Morsi agreed that he was going to step down, or they were going to have new elections, or they were going to do something democratic, some process where you could say, this man doesn't have a mandate because he's lost the will of the people, so we're going to get rid of him. They could have done it through negotiation, because at the end of the day, the Brotherhood's, it's an old-fashioned, stubborn organization, but there are some people in it that are not stupid. You could have reached a compromise, but we're talking about a matter of days. It was like, this is a great chance, let's get rid of this guy. And that was damaging for Egypt.
Paul Danahar is in the studio with me. He's the BBC North America Bureau Chief, and his book is called The New Middle East. What do you think is the biggest problem in Libya right now?
The biggest problem in Libya is that there's too many young men running around with guns, and they don't see any reason why they should give them up. The problem with the Libyan war is it went on for quite a long time, not as long as the Syrian war, but it went on long enough for basically people to stop even caring about the fragile notion of Libya. And their loyalties basically stayed with the people that they were fighting with. So you had this kind of regional factionalism. So it's basically guys with guns is the problem in Libya, and getting them back off them and getting them into some kind of useful employment is going to take a while, and it's going to be difficult. But Libya does have money, so it will be able to keep...
That's oil revenue.
That's oil revenue. So slowly but surely, I think eventually over time, it will be able to buy these guys off. They'll get some kind of government job. They'll.
Are you optimistic about Libya?
Largely, yeah. I mean, I think it's, saying you're optimistic about the Middle East at the moment makes you look absolutely foolish. But I think if you look back at, Eastern Europe, people said when the Iron Curtain fell, and you had suddenly this rise of fascist, right-wing, Nazi-type groups running around, particularly in Eastern Germany. And in Poland, people just said, my God, we've unleashed this terrible kind of chaos, and what a terrible idea it was. And it took a few years before it began to settle down. And nobody would say now that, it was a bad idea to get rid of the Iron Curtain. So I think in the Middle East, we are going to see 4 or 5 years, maybe a decade of chaos. But you can't keep these people locked up in dictatorship forever. It had to change. In the same way that it had to change in South America, it had to change in Eastern Europe. There's been a slower change in Africa, but eventually democracy will come to the Middle East, but it will be painful, it will be slow, and it will probably be in places bloody.
You met Gaddafi. Is he crazy?
I don't think he was crazy. I mean, he acted crazy. The last time I saw him alive, he was driving towards a lamppost, waving at the crowd, and he just stopped from crashing into it by one of his guys pretty much kind of grabbing the wheel. He was driving a golf cart as well. He was an odd guy. But I mean, the thing about Gaddafi, he was out of touch, but I don't think he was mad. He just genuinely believed what a lot of people had told him, which was that everybody loved him, and that the only people that were basically trying to kind of get rid of him were either Islamists or kind of the plot from the West. But he wasn't mad. He
never saw the writing on the wall.
No, well, not originally. I mean, I had sources that were inside the compound during the. I spoke to them afterwards, but that were inside when all the negotiations were going on. He thought it would blow over. He didn't think it would carry on like this. And the fact was that if it hadn't been for NATO intervention, he wouldn't have. He'd still be there today. There's a good chance that even with the NATO intervention, if he'd have been willing to basically compromise, he may have been able to hang on to half the country, because there was a period where people thought that the stalemate was going to lead to Libya being divided. The city that changed that was Misrata. Without Misrata, he couldn't basically control his side of the country. And the people of Misrata basically fought his troops to a standstill, and that kind of changed the game.
We talked a little bit about Syria, but is there hope for Syria?
As the Syria that was there before the uprising, no, I don't think
that Syria's gone.
I think that Syria's gone. I mean, it's gone certainly for the time being. The question is, can you rebuild the society that was Syria? Because there's been so much violence and so much appalling bloodshed and torture and just atrocious acts of violence that it's very hard to see how people are going to be able to forgive, anytime soon. The other problem is that the jihadist groups, if you look at the way the fighting's going on, they're not trying to take over the country at the moment. They're not trying to rush down to Damascus. They're trying to consolidate the areas that they have. So you have a situation in the north of Syria where the Islamist groups are basically more bothered about building up an area that they control than they are about getting rid of Assad. Now, maybe over time that will be their ambition. But I think the problem with Syria is that you have very clearly now a north that's under the influence of the Islamist groups, the south that's increasingly under the influence of groups that are getting support by the West, by the Gulf, along the kind of Jordanian border. And then you have the Gaddafi, the Assad regime, which is still controlling Damascus and primarily is worried about making sure it controls the coast.
So where do you see this going? Is this going to be a partition?
I think we may end up with a kind of Yugoslavia type scenario where you end up with kind of people battling themselves to a state of exhaustion. And then when you get to a state of exhaustion, people are willing to talk. But it's very hard to see how, even with a federal structure, that people are going to take any kind of advice or guidance or leadership from Damascus anymore. I mean, if you think about it, Syria anyway, it was a European creation to start off with. Syria, Iraq. No one's ever been able to hold them together with anything other than force, because they're not natural countries. They were created by Europeans drawing lines on maps over a cup of tea. I mean, they've never really existed in any other way than I've got a country and I'm going to hang on to it, and if you don't do what I say, I'm going to shoot you.
So you think if America had done something early on, we could have stopped the bloodshed?
I think if America, along with NATO and Turkey, had actually created at the top some kind of buffer zone where in the north of Syria, along the Turkish border, and that may have been, the opportunity was probably when the Syrians shot down the Turkish aircraft. Then you could have said, right, we are going to have Patriot missiles on the border, and if you come within 25 kilometers of that border with anything flying, we're going to shoot it down.
And how would that have helped?
That would have created an area where people could have defected to. Because the problem with Syria was that if you dash off with your wife and kids, your aunts, your uncles, your parents, your extended family were all going to get thrown in jail. So you needed somewhere where you could all run away to. And then you would have got defections higher up the chain, where you could have actually had people, like you had in Libya, that could have run an opposition, that had some kind of credibility, that had some sense that they had a future in a new Syria. And then you would have had a base for people to work on. And then when you had a base, you could have basically controlled who was getting the arms, how they were getting the arms, some kind of infrastructure being put in place where you could slowly eat away at the Assad regime and then perhaps topple it, like happened in Libya. But that didn't happen. It didn't happen, I think, partly because people were scared about what was going to come after Syria, partly because both the Russians and the Americans were busy in the electoral cycle and they took their eye off the ball. And basically Turkey kind of played its kind of game, and then when it came to it, didn't really want to get involved either. So, Syria is a mess. It's a mess because everybody thought it was going to be a mess. Nobody really wanted to own that mess. And now we've got what we've got.
I want to read you a tweet from Carl Sharrow. He's a blogger. And he said this: Syria will change from a backward, oppressive, cultish regime led by mustached men to a backward, oppressive, cultish regime led by bearded men. Is that what we're looking at in Syria and maybe in some of the other Arab Spring states?
I think we're looking at that possibly in the north of Syria. The question is, if you look at what happened in Yugoslavia, which is a kind of similar type scenario, a country kind of created by European meddling and basically that fell apart. You had an influx of jihadis there too, but when the war was over, they got kicked out. The locals didn't want them, and these were Muslim areas as well. There were lots of Muslims there are lots of Muslims in that part of Europe. So there is a possibility that actually a lot of the people that are now, shouting Allahu Akbar and, wearing long beards will shave them off as soon as the war is over, because you kind of got to buy into the ideology of who's giving you the money. The problem was at the beginning, if you were a moderate, you didn't get any money. But if you were leaning towards, slightly more radical, then the Saudis, mainly Saudi individuals, and the Qataris were willing to fund you. The Qataris were funding the Muslim Brotherhood. Individual Saudis were funding basically jihadi groups, and they were allowed to just get on with it. And so if you were not part of that gang, you didn't get any money, you didn't get any weapons, and so you lost people.
You don't think they totally believe in that ideology?
No, I don't think. I don't think a lot of them do. I met a woman who's very kind of involved in the opposition group in Damascus, and she said to me, "Look, I just went and met some people from the Nusra Front, and I went like this." And her head wasn't covered. She was wearing a pair of jeans. She said they shook my hands. We had a conversation. We didn't meet. We didn't have a meeting of minds, but they were quite happy to meet me. She said, "Just some of these guys, they get money from Qatar. They have to dress in the right way, but they're going to shave their beards off and they're going to let their trousers get long again." So, but I think that there are undoubtedly now a core group of really serious, hardline, militant groups. Terrorists is the word that many people around the world would use to describe them, and they are going to be a problem. And the problem also is, if you look at what happened in Iraq when you had those groups, you had at least America there to create the Sons of Iraq that would basically help them drive these people out. There's nobody to help drive out these people when the war is over.
Paul Danahar is in the studio with me. He's an award-winning journalist. Formerly, he was the Middle East bureau chief for the BBC, currently North America bureau chief. His book is called The New Middle East. Speaking of Saudi Arabia, why haven't there been uprisings, demonstrations in Saudi Arabia of young people demanding democracy?
Well, there have been demonstrations in the Shia areas. I mean, they have been complaining and they have been seeking more rights. The thing about the Saudis is they can buy you off. I mean, they've got a very well-funded security apparatus. So basically, they buy off people, and then the people that are left over, they lock them up. And there's not much noise about human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia.
But that can't last forever.
Well, it can't last forever. While they've still got money, it can't last forever. The other thing that allows it to go on is the fact that America will turn a blind eye to Saudis because they need their oil at the moment. Not because they physically need that oil, but they need the price of oil not to go through the roof because it's a global market. What I think will change with the Saudis is, and it's different from between them and the Qataris, the Saudis have quite a big population. There are pockets of poverty, believe it or not, in Saudi Arabia, and there's lots of angry, bored young people. If you look at Saudi Arabia, has the biggest, fastest growing Twitter community on the planet because it's the only way they can express themselves. And when you look at the kind of things being tweeted by Saudi Saudis, young Saudis, they're fed up. But if you get a change, if fracking becomes something that changes the model for oil production, and if it is found in easily and in ways that doesn't upset the people whose homes are being dug underneath across America, across Europe, across China, that would change the price of oil. And the Saudis need the price of oil to be over $100 a barrel to sustain what they have at the moment.
So are you saying we could, in our generation, be completely independent of Middle Eastern oil?
Yeah, we could. The Americas certainly could. The question, the reality is, though, it's a global market. So
China still needs the oil.
China still needs the oil. India still needs the oil. But China quite possibly has very large deposits of this new kind of oil that you get. It's tight oil, they call it, through fracking. So there's a good possibility that much of the developed world and the developing world will have an alternative form of energy. Now, that doesn't mean that the market's going to fall out. The bottom's going to fall out of the market for the Saudis, but it does mean that they may end up getting much less per barrel than they are now, and that therefore means they have to change what they can give their people, and that may therefore lead to people saying, "Well, my life's got worse, and I want change," and that may lead to change.
Do you think democracy in the Arab world is inevitable, or is it possible that some of those Arab Spring states could go back to authoritarianism?
I don't think that they can go back to authoritarianism, because I just think...
You think the cat's out of the bag?
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't mean necessarily that you're not going to have democratic states that don't look as democratic as this one. You could argue that Russia is an example of a state that's kind of a democracy, but around the edges, it's wanting. You may end up with states that don't look as democratic as everyone would like them to be. And unquestionably, Islam is going to play quite an important role in those states, in the same way that, you can't take politics out of the Middle East, and you can't take religion out of the politics of the Middle East, and you can't take religion out of the politics of America. I mean, the Middle East, in many ways, like America, takes its faith very seriously. I think it's a very important part of people's identity. It's a very important part of their lives, and so therefore it plays a very important part of their politics.
It's just the issue of protecting minority rights and women's rights.
Exactly, but that's an issue
that really gives people pause.
Oh yeah, but that's an issue. That's an issue in Israel as well. I mean, if you get on a bus in Israel as a woman and you drive through an ultra-Orthodox area, you'll get abused. You'll be told to go and sit at the back. Buses that drive around in ultra-Orthodox areas of Israel that have pictures of women on the side get stones thrown at them. Some of them have been burnt. So, I mean, the issue of there's no question that in Israel, women's rights are much, much better served. There's no question that Israel has much better safeguards for minorities and safeguards for women. But the issue amongst conservative religious people is the same. Doesn't matter where it is.
Paul Danahar, he's the award-winning journalist, BBC North America Bureau Chief, previously Middle East Bureau Chief for the BBC. The book is The New Middle East, The World After the Arab Spring. Paul, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you very much for having me.